She worked for him for 4 years. 4 years of watching men twice her size go pale at the sound of his name. 4 years of filing documents she was never supposed to read, of standing 3 steps behind him at meetings where the wrong word got people killed. 4 years of telling herself it meant nothing, that the way he looked at her sometimes was just her imagination running wild. Then one night changed all of it. Now she's sitting in a hospital bathroom, staring at a positive pregnancy test, and trying to figure out how to disappear before the most dangerous man in New York finds out he's going to be a father. If you want to know what happens next, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The resignation letter had taken Sienna Hart 3 separate drafts, and approximately 11 days of talking herself in and out of it, and even now, standing outside Dominic Moretti's office door with the folded envelope in her hand, she wasn't entirely sure she was going to go through with it. She stood in the hallway of the 44th floor of Moretti Tower, 40 stories above Midtown Manhattan, and she breathed, just breathed, the kind of deliberate, measured breathing she'd taught herself years ago when she first took this job, and realized that working for a man like Dominic Moretti meant learning very quickly how to keep your face still, even when everything underneath it was coming apart. The hallway was empty. It was 6:40 in the morning. She'd come in early on purpose, because early was the only time Dominic was ever alone, before the lawyers arrived, before the senior partners, before Marcus Webb, his head of security, took up his usual post outside the door like a wall with a suit on. She needed him alone. She needed this to be quiet. She needed it to be over. Her reflection caught in the glass panel beside the office door, dark circles under her eyes. She'd done her best to cover, her hair pulled back tighter than comfortable because she needed to look composed, a gray blazer over a white blouse, the kind of outfit she'd worn 100 times. Professional, put together, the outfit of a woman who had everything under control. She looked like a liar. Sienna pressed 2 fingers against her sternum for exactly 3 seconds. An old habit, something her mother used to call finding your floor. And then she knocked. "It's open." His voice, even after 4 years, it still did something to her chest she had no language for. Low, flat. The kind of voice that didn't perform anything, didn't rise or fall for effect. Dominic Moretti said words the way other men signed contracts. Final. Binding. No room for renegotiation. She pushed the door open. He was already at his desk, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, one hand moving through a stack of overnight reports, and the other wrapped around a coffee mug that said absolutely nothing decorative on it, because of course it didn't. The Manhattan skyline spread out behind him through floor-to-ceiling glass, the city still gray and half-lit in the early morning, and he looked like something carved out of it. Dark hair slightly disheveled in a way that would be fully corrected by 8 a.m. Sharp jaw. That permanent set to his mouth that people who didn't know him read as anger, and people who did know him read as something more complicated. Control, maybe. The exhausting, ceaseless project of keeping everything inside contained. He didn't look up immediately. He never did. He finished whatever line he was reading first. "You're 40 minutes early," he said. "I know." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I needed to talk to you before the day started." He looked up then. His eyes, dark gray, the color of water before a storm, moved over her face with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was trying to assess quickly. She had watched him do it to lawyers, to rivals, to men who came into rooms thinking they held the advantage. She had never quite gotten used to being on the receiving end of it. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." She crossed the room and stopped at the edge of his desk, and she held out the envelope. "I'm resigning." A pause. He looked at the envelope, then back at her. His expression didn't change, which was the thing about Dominic Moretti that had unraveled her slowly and completely over 4 years. His face almost never changed, which meant you couldn't trust the stillness. The stillness wasn't absence, it was compression. "Explain," he said. "It's in the letter." "I'm not reading the letter, I'm asking you to explain." Sienna kept her hand extended. Her arm didn't shake. She was proud of that, in a small, grim way. "I've been offered another position," she said. "It's a good opportunity. I think it's the right time for a change." Every word of that was technically true and entirely hollow, and she knew he knew it. Dominic Moretti had built an empire on his ability to identify the exact gap between what people said and what they meant. He did not take the envelope. "You've been offered another position," he repeated. "Yes." "Where?" "A firm in Chicago." He leaned back in his chair slowly, like a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. "You've never mentioned wanting to move to Chicago. People don't announce every plan they're making." "No," he said, "they don't, but they usually have a reason for the ones they keep quiet." She set the envelope on the corner of his desk when he still didn't take it. Her pulse was moving too fast and she was managing it, barely, through the careful mechanics of keeping her breathing even. "The letter covers everything about the transition. I'll stay through the end of the month to handle handover. I don't want this to be disruptive." Sienna, just her name, nothing attached to it. But the way he said it, the particular weight he put on it, like he was turning it over in his mouth to find something he'd missed before, made her chest tighten in a way that was infuriating and devastating in equal measure. "This is a professional decision," she said, and she was very careful with her voice. "I'd appreciate it if we could treat it as one." Something moved in his expression then, something small and fast that she couldn't quite name before it was gone. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the envelope from the edge of his desk and held it in one hand without opening it, just held it, turning it slightly in his fingers. "I'll review this," he said. "We'll talk this afternoon." "There isn't anything to talk about." "This afternoon," he said again, in the tone that didn't invite argument. 3:00. She wanted to push back. She needed to push back, because if this dragged out, if she had to sit across from him day after day and keep doing this, keep performing normalcy, keep pretending the last 3 months hadn't happened, keep looking at him and feeling the full weight of everything she was carrying and couldn't say, she was going to come apart. She knew it. She could feel it in the tremble she was suppressing somewhere behind her ribs. But she said, "Fine," because she had always been better at retreating from Dominic Moretti than standing her ground, and she turned and walked back to the door on legs that held. She made it to her own desk. She sat down. She opened her laptop and pulled up the morning briefing files because that was what she did every morning, and routine was the only thing holding her together. 11:40. She was going to make it to 11:40, and then she had a doctor's appointment she had told no one about, and she was going to handle that appointment, and then she was going to come back here and get through 3:00, and then she was going to go home and figure out the next step. One thing at a time, 1 hour at a time. She was not going to fall apart in Dominic Moretti's office building. She had been telling herself that for 12 weeks. The doctor's office was on the Upper East Side, 3 blocks from the park, the kind of quiet private practice that Sienna had specifically chosen because it had no professional connection to anyone in the Moretti organization and no reason to ever appear on any document that crossed Dominic's desk. She had paid in cash for the first appointment. She had given her mother's maiden name on the intake form, which was the kind of thing that would have seemed absurd to her a year ago and now felt like basic self-preservation. Dr. Rena Park was a compact woman in her late 40s with direct eyes and the particular manner of a physician who had been delivering complicated news to people for long enough that she'd learned how to do it without softening it into uselessness. "You're 12 weeks," Dr. Park said, turning the ultrasound screen slightly toward Sienna. "Strong heartbeat. Everything is measuring exactly where it should be." Sienna stared at the screen. She had been staring at variations of this image for weeks now. At the pictures from her first appointment, at the one she'd taken with her phone and then deleted and then found herself searching through her recently deleted folder for at 2 a.m, and it still didn't feel entirely real. It felt like something happening to someone else that she was observing from a slight distance. "You mentioned last time that you were still deciding about next steps," Dr. Park said, in a tone that was clinical and careful and entirely non-judgmental. "I've decided," Sienna said. "I'm keeping it." "Good," Dr. Park made a note. "Then we'll talk about what the next trimester looks like. Are you managing stress levels?" Sienna almost laughed. It came out as a kind of exhale that she converted into a cough. "I'm working on it. I mean it as a medical question, not a rhetorical one. Elevated cortisol at this stage has real implications. You need to be thinking about sleep, about your environment. I'm resigning from my job today, Sienna said. I'm planning to move. I'm working on it. Dr. Parks studied her for a moment. Is the father in the picture? The question sat in the air of the small examination room, and Sienna looked at the ultrasound screen and thought about Dominic Moretti sitting at his enormous desk, 44 floors above Manhattan, turning her resignation letter in his fingers with that unreadable expression on his face. And she thought about a night 3 months ago that she had replayed so many times, it was starting to feel like a film she'd memorized rather than something that had actually happened to her body in her life. No, she said. He's not. She made it back to Moretti Tower at 2:15. She made it through 45 minutes of actual work, 2 contract reviews, a set of meeting confirmations for the following week that she was technically scheduling for a job she would no longer have, and then at 3 o'clock she stood up from her desk and walked down the hall toward his office, and she was 3 feet from the door when her vision went gray at the edges. It happened fast. One moment she was walking, and the next the floor tilted and her hand shot out and found the wall, and that was all it found because there was nothing else to grab, and her legs simply stopped working, and she went down. She was conscious this whole time, which was the strange part. She was aware of the floor against her knees, the cold of the hallway, the sound of her own breathing, which had gone shallow and wrong. She was aware of a door opening and then Marcus's voice, sharp and loud, calling her name, and then footsteps, fast ones, the kind made by a person who does not move quickly for anything but had started moving quickly now. Then Dominic was crouching in front of her, one hand gripping her arm and the other on her face, turning it toward him, and his expression had broken open in a way she had never once seen in 4 years. Not controlled, not compressed, something raw and frightened underneath the surface of him, cracking through all that discipline. Sienna, look at me. She looked at him. Her vision was stabilizing. The grayness was pulling back. I'm okay, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. You're not okay. You're on the floor. He looked up at Marcus over her head. Call an ambulance. No. She grabbed his arm. No, I don't need... It was just a dizzy spell. I stood up too fast. You didn't stand up. You were walking down the hall. He was still looking at her with that expression she couldn't process, that fractured attentiveness. How long have you been feeling like this? Dominic, how long? She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. A few weeks, she said. On and off. I have low blood pressure sometimes. It's nothing. Marcus, he said. Already calling, Marcus said. I don't need an ambulance, she said, and she hated how her voice was shaking now, hated that she was on the floor of this hallway looking up at him, hated that this was happening here, in this building, in his proximity, when she was 11 hours away from being gone. I just need a minute. I need to sit down properly. You are sitting down, Dominic said, on the floor, because you collapsed. He shifted his grip on her arm, steadying. Stop arguing with me. She stopped arguing. She was too tired to argue, and the nausea that had been manageable all morning was suddenly not manageable anymore. And she was focusing everything she had on not being sick in the hallway of the 44th floor of Moretti Tower, which felt like a bare minimum requirement for the day. The ambulance took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Dominic sat on the floor of the hallway beside her and did not leave, and did not look away, and she did not know what to do with any of it. The emergency department of Lenox Hill was exactly as loud and fluorescent as emergency departments always were, and Sienna sat on a bed behind a curtain and went through the intake questions with a nurse who was brisk and efficient and thorough, and who eventually said, "We're going to run a complete panel. When was your last menstrual period?" Sienna answered. The nurse's pen paused on the clipboard. "And you're currently pregnant?" "Yes," Sienna said. From the other side of the curtain, she heard the particular quality of silence that means a person has stopped moving entirely. She closed her eyes. She should have fought harder to make him stay in the waiting room. She had said twice that there was no reason for him to come back here, that she was fine, that he should go back to the office, that she had this handled. He had said nothing in response both times, which was Dominic's way of saying absolutely not without wasting words on it. And now he was standing 2 feet away on the other side of a thin curtain, and he had just heard everything. The nurse glanced at the curtain and then back at Sienna with an expression of professional neutrality. I'll have the OB resident come down and take a look. Just relax for now. She left. The curtain shifted. Dominic stepped through it. He looked the way she imagined she looked, like someone who had just had something slam into them hard enough to knock the breath out, and was now doing the work of deciding how to still be standing. His face was not closed off. She had spent 4 years reading the closed-off version, and this was not it. This was something else. Something she didn't have a catalog entry for. He crossed to the plastic chair beside her bed and sat down. And for a long time he didn't say anything at all, and neither did she. And the noise of the emergency department went on around them. Voices, equipment, someone 3 curtains over arguing about discharge paperwork. And the silence between them was enormous and weightless and terrible. How far along, he said finally. 12 weeks. He absorbed that. She watched him do it. Watched him calculate backward. Watched something in his expression confirm what she knew he was already certain of. There had been no one else. They both knew there had been no one else. This was a math problem with only one answer. You were going to leave, he said, without telling me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation, quite. It was the flat statement of a man who had picked up a fact and was simply turning it over, looking at all its surfaces. Yes, she said. There was no point in lying. Not here, not now. Why? She looked at the white curtain across from her, at the thin fabric and the rings on the rod, and the particular institutional beige of a hospital ceiling. She thought about 12 weeks of carrying this alone, about every version of this conversation she'd played out in her head, every way she'd imagined telling him, every way she'd imagined it going wrong. She had imagined him angry. She had imagined him cold and dismissive. She had imagined the particular controlled cruelty he was capable of when someone did something he found inconvenient. She had not imagined him sitting beside her on a plastic hospital chair looking like something had reached into his chest and rearranged everything inside it. Because I knew how you'd react, she said. You didn't know. I watched you end a 15-year partnership with a man who got sloppy and personal. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I watched you cut off your own cousin because he became a liability. I know how you react when people complicate your life, Dominic. I was trying to protect... She stopped. Yourself, he said quietly. Yes. A beat. And the baby. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that she turned to look at him, to try to read whatever was happening in that face she had spent 4 years studying. His hands were on his knees, not entirely still. A tension in them she could see, but that he wasn't letting travel anywhere. Jaw tight, breathing controlled. But underneath all of that, under all the machinery of composure he'd built, something was working its way up that he wasn't able to stop. I'm not him, he said. She didn't understand what he meant at first. My father, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, dropped slightly, like the word cost something to say. I know what people think I am. I know what I look like from the outside. He stopped, started again. I'm not him. She looked at him. She had known Dominic Moretti for 4 years, and she had learned most of the things about him that were possible to learn from outside the walls he kept around himself. She knew his professional history, his habits, his routines, the architecture of his public persona. She knew the rumors about his father, about how he'd left, about what Dominic had built in the years after from nothing but anger and intelligence and a particular ruthless clarity about what he wanted. She had never heard him say any of it out loud. I know you're not, she said, and she meant it, and that was the most frightening thing about all of this. That she had spent 12 weeks trying to run from this moment, and she was sitting here now, and the thing she felt, underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the nausea, was something dangerously close to relief. The OB resident appeared through the curtain, young and efficient, clipboard in hand, and Dominic straightened in his chair and his face closed back down into something professional and composed, and the moment, whatever it had been, was sealed over. But he didn't move from the plastic chair beside her bed. He stayed exactly where he was while the doctor asked questions and took notes and ordered an ultrasound, and his presence was solid and complicated and not going anywhere. When the doctor left, Sienna said quietly, You don't have to stay. I'm staying, he said. Dominic, I'm staying, Sienna. He looked at her then, direct and unambiguous, and there was something in his eyes that was not soft. Dominic Moretti was not a soft man, and nothing about this situation was going to make him one. But it was present, fully, uncomplicatedly present. We're going to figure this out. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the resignation letter sitting on the corner of his desk. She thought about the apartment in Chicago she hadn't actually found yet, the plan that had been more fantasy than logistics, the version of her future in which she was somewhere else, and this was someone else's problem. I had a whole plan, she said, almost to herself. I know, he said. It was a bad plan. She should have argued with that. She was too tired, and somewhere underneath the tiredness, in a place she was not ready to look at directly, she thought he might be right. The ultrasound confirmed everything Dr. Park had already told her. The technician turned the screen so they could both see, and explained the measurements and pointed to the flicker of heartbeat that had been making Sienna feel like the ground was unstable beneath her feet for 3 months running. She watched Dominic watch the screen, and she watched something happen to his face that she had no vocabulary for. Not the controlled fracturing of the hallway, not the calculated stillness of his office, but something much older than either of those, something that looked like a man discovering that a word he'd been using his entire life without fully understanding it had just acquired an entirely new meaning. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They kept her for observation through the evening. Blood pressure concerns the doctor wanted to monitor, and Dominic made exactly 2 phone calls, stepping outside the curtained bay briefly, his voice low and controlled in a way that she knew meant he was canceling or delegating something significant. When he came back, he sat back down in the plastic chair, and he stayed there. At some point, he ordered food from somewhere. She never quite figured out how, whether he'd sent Marcus or called someone, and a paper bag appeared with soup and crackers and a bottle of water, and he set it on the tray table in front of her without ceremony, the way you did things for someone when you'd moved past the point of making gestures and arrived at the point of just doing what needed to be done. She ate the soup. It was the first full meal she'd managed in 3 days. You've been not eating, he said. I've been having trouble with nausea. For how long? Since about week 6. She paused. It's normal. It's supposed to get better. He processed that with the expression he used for information he didn't like and couldn't argue with. You should have told me. I wasn't going to tell you at all, she said, and there was no accusation in it, just the plain fact of it. He looked at her. The thing in his eyes was complicated. I understand why you thought that was the right decision. But you were wrong, he said, simply. Not cruelly, just plainly. And I'm here now, so we start from here. She thought about arguing. She thought about the 12 weeks of arguments she'd had with herself. All the reasons, all the logic, the perfectly constructed case she'd been building for why disappearing was the rational choice. All of it felt flimsy now, sitting in this fluorescent room with him 3 feet away. You can't just decide that, she said. You can't just show up and announce that we're handling it and expect that to make everything. I'm not announcing anything, he said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. What you do is your decision. He paused. But I'm not disappearing. I want you to know that now so you're not building plans around the assumption that I will. She stared at him. You barely looked at me for 3 months, she said. The words came out before she could stop them, and she heard the rawness in them, the thing she'd been holding back for weeks, for longer than weeks if she was being entirely honest. After the gala, you looked at me like I was a problem you needed to manage, every single day, and I had to sit at that desk and… She stopped, pressed her lips together. I know, he said. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. I know what I did. Then why, because I didn't know what to do with it. He said it like it cost him something, like it was being extracted rather than offered. I don't… That's not something I do. I don't… He stopped, tried again. I've spent a very long time making sure nothing gets close enough to matter. It's not an excuse. It's an explanation. I know the difference. Sienna looked at him. This man who frightened people for a living, who had built walls around himself so thoroughly and for so long that most people who spent time in his vicinity stopped even trying to find a way through them, sitting in a plastic hospital chair at 9:30 in the evening with his sleeves still rolled up and his hair no longer perfectly arranged, and the carefully maintained distance between himself and the rest of the world cracked open in a way that might not be fixable. She was so tired. She was so tired of being afraid, of carrying this alone, of performing fine when she was not fine, of building elaborate escape plans from a feeling she didn't know how to name. "I'm not making any decisions tonight," she said. "Okay. I need to think. I need time." "Okay," he said again, "and I need you to stop looking at me like that." He didn't ask like what. Maybe he knew. He looked down at his hands on his knees, and something shifted in his posture. Not a softening, exactly, more of a deliberate unclenching, like a man practicing something he was not naturally good at. "I have a proposition," he said after a moment. "I'm not interested in—" "Hear it first." He looked up. "Move into the penthouse. Not permanently if you don't want that, not as anything other than a practical arrangement. You're 12 weeks pregnant, you collapsed today, your blood pressure is running high, and you were planning to move to a city where you don't have a support system and handle this alone." He paused. "Move in. Let me have the security team involved. Give the situation a few months before you make any permanent decisions about where you're going." She stared at him. "You're suggesting I move into your home," she said. "Yes." "Because of the baby." "Partly." She waited. "And because—" He stopped. Something moved through his face, uncomfortable and unfinished. "Because I handled what happened badly, and I'd like the chance to handle the next part better." The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere beyond the curtain, a monitor beeped steadily. Sienna Hart sat in a hospital bed at 9:30 at night in New York City, 12 weeks pregnant, a resignation letter still sitting on the desk of the man she was refusing to look at directly because she already knew, had known for longer than she wanted to admit, that she was in love with him, that she had been for years, and that this was either the most sensible decision she would ever make or the most catastrophic one, and she genuinely could not tell the difference. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's enough," he said, and he stayed in the plastic chair beside her bed until the doctors cleared her at 11:15, and he rode down in the elevator beside her in silence, and he put her in the car that Marcus had waiting and told the driver her address, and he stood on the sidewalk in front of Lenox Hill Hospital and watched the car pull away, and she did not look back, but she knew he didn't move until she was out of sight. She knew because she had spent 4 years learning to know things about him without looking. The car moved through the late-night streets. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, that gesture she'd been making for weeks now, half conscious, half deliberate. She told herself she was going to think clearly. She told herself she was going to make a rational decision in the morning, that she was not going to let one night in a hospital and one conversation and the particular way he'd looked at that ultrasound screen undo every careful plan she'd made. She told herself that right up until the moment she got home and found Marcus Webb standing outside her apartment building, hands clasped in front of him, with the patient expression of a man who'd been told to wait and had been told by someone who didn't say please. "Mr. Moretti asked me to stay with you tonight," Marcus said, "in case you need anything." Sienna looked at him for a long moment. She thought about arguing. She didn't. She went upstairs, and she lay in her bed, and she stared at the ceiling, and at some point before 3 in the morning, she picked up her phone and opened the text thread with Dominic that was all scheduling confirmations and calendar items and professional back and forth going back 4 years, and she typed one sentence: "I'll think about the proposition seriously." The response came in under 2 minutes. "Thank you." She put the phone down. Outside her window, New York breathed and moved and didn't stop for anyone. And somewhere across the city, the most dangerous man she'd ever known was awake. And she was going to have his child, and nothing about any of it was simple or clean or the way she'd planned. But then again, neither was he. And somewhere between the resignation letter and the hospital floor and the plastic chair and the way he'd looked at a heartbeat on a screen, something had shifted in the architecture of whatever this was, cracked open just enough to let in something she hadn't planned for either. She didn't know yet if that was the beginning of something, or the beginning of the end of something. She only knew that she was not, for the first time in 12 weeks, making plans to run. That was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most foolish, possibly both. With Dominic Moretti, it had always been both. The city hummed beyond the window. She closed her eyes, and far above Midtown Manhattan, on the 44th floor of a building that bore his name, a resignation letter sat unopened and unread on the corner of a desk that had always belonged to a man who had never, in the entire course of his life, learned to ask for the things he needed. Until tonight. She gave him her answer on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the hospital. She didn't call. She didn't text. She showed up at the penthouse at 9 a.m. with one suitcase and the expression of a woman who had made a decision she wasn't entirely at peace with and intended to live inside it anyway, because the alternative was worse, and she was done pretending otherwise. Marcus opened the door. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her face. He had the good sense not to say anything except, "Mr. Moretti's in the kitchen," and stepped aside. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a residential tower 6 blocks from Moretti Tower, and it was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like what she'd imagined. She had built a version of it in her head over 4 years, all glass and cold surfaces, and the particular sterile perfection of a space that exists to demonstrate wealth rather than to be lived in. What she found instead was large and spare but not cold. The kitchen opened to a living area with actual wear on the leather couch. A stack of hardcover books on the coffee table with actual spines cracked on the ones he'd read more than once. The kind of details that belong to a person rather than a performance. Dominic was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug, and the morning's financial briefing spread across the counter in front of him. And when she came around the corner, he looked up, and his eyes went straight to the suitcase. "1 bag," he said. "I'm not committing to furniture," she said. Something in his expression moved. Not quite a smile. Closer to a reluctant acknowledgement, the expression of a man filing a response undernoted rather than welcome. "There's a room at the end of the hall. I can carry my own bag," she said. He looked at her for a beat. "Okay." She carried her own bag. The room was large and clean, with a window that looked east over the city, and a bathroom she had entirely to herself, and a closet that was mostly empty and waiting. She set the suitcase on the bench at the foot of the bed, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet, and she breathed, and she told herself she had made the right call, and she almost believed it. She was back in the kitchen in 10 minutes because sitting in the room alone with her thoughts felt worse than facing him. He had not moved from the counter. He poured a second mug of coffee without asking and slid it across to her side, and she sat on the bar stool across from him and wrapped her hands around the mug, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a kitchen at 9 in the morning, pretending that this was a normal situation, that normal people navigated without everything beneath the surface threatening to pull the floor out. "Rules," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "If this is going to work, there need to be rules, boundaries, things that are mine and things that aren't." "All right," he said. "My schedule is mine. My appointments, my decisions about the pregnancy, She stopped, recalibrated. "You don't get to override my doctor. You don't get to make choices about my body because you've decided you know better." "I wouldn't." "You absolutely would," she said flatly. "I've watched you operate for 4 years. You see a situation that needs managing, and you manage it. I am not a situation." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was working out whether she was right rather than working out how to argue. "Okay," he said. "That's fair. I'm still looking for work. I'm not going to sit here and be kept." "I haven't asked you to." "I know you haven't. I'm telling you now so it's not a conversation we have later." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "You came prepared. I've been rehearsing this in my head for 4 days. Did I argue less in your head?" "Considerably." That one got closer to an actual expression, a brief fractured thing at the corner of his mouth that was gone before it fully arrived. He set his mug down. "I have a meeting at 10:30 that I need to be on site for. Marcus will be here. The kitchen is stocked. There's a card on the counter for anything it isn't stocked with. I'm not using your credit card. It's for the household. I have my own money, Dominic." He stopped, looked at her. Something moved through his expression that might have been frustration and might have been something else. The friction of 2 people with deeply established ways of operating, discovering that those ways do not naturally fit together. "We're going to argue about everything, aren't we?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Probably," she said. "Yes." He picked up his briefings. "Good to know." The first 2 weeks were a specific kind of difficult that Sienna hadn't fully prepared for. It wasn't hostile. That would have been easier in some ways. Cleaner. Something to push against. What it was instead was careful. They moved around each other in the penthouse with the particular practiced avoidance of 2 people who were both very aware of each other and very committed to not making that awareness into something that had to be addressed directly. Polite. Functional. The architecture of a shared space established with the minimum necessary conversation. He left early. He came back late. Some nights she was already in her room when she heard the front door and his footsteps down the hall and the sound of him moving around the kitchen, and she would lie there listening to the small domestic sounds of it and feel something complicated moving around in her chest that she was not ready to name. The nausea was getting marginally better. She was eating more consistently, which helped. She had 2 more prenatal appointments, and she went to both of them alone, which she had specifically told him she preferred. And both times she came home to find him in the kitchen at whatever hour the appointment had wrapped. Working, always working, but there. And the first time it happened, she thought it was coincidence, and the second time she understood that it wasn't. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer commentary. He just made sure he was available to be asked, which was, and she hated this somewhat, actually the right call. It was exactly what she'd needed without being what she'd demanded, and she found herself resenting the precision of it. "You looked up how to handle a pregnant person who doesn't want to be handled," she said, the second time, setting her bag down at the kitchen counter. He didn't look up from his laptop. "I read some things." "How many things?" "Several books." She stared at him. "You read pregnancy books." "I read material that seemed relevant to the situation." He looked up then. "How was the appointment?" "Good. Everything's on track." She paused. "She's measuring well. She stopped. "It's a girl. I found out today. I hadn't told you yet." Something happened to his face. Something she didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one for because it was too immediate and too unguarded, and she didn't think he knew it was visible. "A girl," he said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, like a man absorbing something that required more interior space than he currently had available. "Is she healthy?" "She's perfect," Sienna said, and her voice did something she hadn't planned for, caught slightly on the word, and she looked away and busied herself with her bag because she was not going to cry in front of him in the kitchen over a word. She heard him push back from the counter, heard his footsteps. He came around to her side and set a glass of water on the counter in front of her, and he stood there a beat, close but not touching, and she was acutely aware of the heat of him and the particular quality of his stillness when he was trying to figure out what to do with something. "I'm okay," she said without looking up. "I know," he said. He didn't move away. She picked up the glass of water. He went back to his side of the counter. They ate dinner. He had ordered from the Italian place 3 blocks over, something she'd mentioned offhand 2 weeks ago preferring, which meant he'd remembered and filed it, which was the kind of thing that shouldn't mean anything and somehow meant a tremendous amount. And they talked about logistics, about the next appointment, about the room that was currently his home office that he had mentioned converting to a nursery. Practical things, safe things. But something had shifted, slightly, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Sienna was in the living room with her laptop, working through the early stages of a freelance project she'd picked up through a former colleague, when Marcus appeared in the hallway with the expression he used when something had happened that needed to be managed before Dominic found out about it in the wrong way. "There's a situation," Marcus said. "That's not a reassuring opening. Ms. Russo is downstairs." Sienna looked up from her laptop. "Valentina Russo?" "Yes." She had known the name for 4 years. Valentina Russo, 42, Italian-born, based out of Milan with operational interests across 3 European countries and a relationship with Dominic that predated Sienna's employment by nearly a decade. Business partner, Allie, the kind of person whose name appeared on the short list of people Dominic actually trusted, which was a list so short it barely qualified as a list. "Does Dominic know she's here?" "He's on a call. She said she'd wait." "In the lobby?" Marcus's expression did something complicated. "She came up. She's in the second sitting room." Sienna closed her laptop. "She came up. She has standing access to the building." Of course she did. Sienna stood up. She was 14 weeks pregnant and wearing a gray sweater, and she had not slept particularly well, and she was not dressed for whatever this was. But she went down the hall because the alternative was sitting in the living room listening to her own heartbeat and waiting, and that was worse. Valentina Russo was standing at the window of the second sitting room, looking out over the city with the posture of a woman who was accustomed to rooms belonging to her regardless of whose name was on the lease. She was striking, dark hair cut short, a tailored coat over a silk blouse, the kind of effortless presentation that was actually a great deal of effort made invisible. She turned when Sienna came in, and her eyes moved over Sienna with a precise, unhurried assessment that Sienna recognized because she had watched Dominic do it 100 times. "Sienna Hart," Valentina said. "I've heard about you." "I've heard about you," Sienna said. "Can I ask who let you up?" "Dominic's building," Valentina said pleasantly. "Dominic's rules, not yours." A pause. The pleasantness didn't quite reach her eyes. "Forgive me, that was blunt. I've been traveling for 17 hours and my manners are suffering." She moved from the window to one of the chairs with the ease of someone who had sat in this room before and expected to again. "Sit down. I'm not here to be unpleasant." Sienna did not sit. "What are you here for?" "To see Dominic." Valentina's eyes dropped briefly, without ceremony, to Sienna's midsection and came back up. "And to understand what's happening, since Dominic has been somewhat abbreviated in his communications lately." She tilted her head. "How far along are you?" "That's not something I'm going to discuss with you." 14 weeks, Marcus tells me." Sienna looked at the door, made a note internally about Marcus and what information he considered shareable and with whom. "Then why ask?" Valentina smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind built to look warmer than it was. "I'm asking because I'm trying to understand the situation. Dominic and I have worked together for 9 years. We have interests that depend on stability, on predictability, and in the past 3 months, something has shifted in how he's operating, and I want to understand what that is." "That's a conversation to have with him." "I will." She looked at Sienna steadily. "But I wanted to meet you first, to get a sense of—" She paused, selected a word with visible care. "The dynamic." "The dynamic," Sienna repeated. "He's protective of you," Valentina said. "More than is typical. That concerns me." "Why would that concern you?" "Because men who are protective make mistakes." She said it without heat, as a simple observation. "They make decisions based on emotion rather than calculation. In our line of work, in Dominic's line of work, that creates exposure for him, for the people connected to him." Her eyes stayed on Sienna's. "For you." Sienna looked at her, at the careful face and the careful words and the precise, unhurried way she was delivering something that was either a warning or a threat, wearing a warning's clothing, and she couldn't entirely tell which. "I appreciate the concern," Sienna said. "I think you should wait for Dominic in here and I'll let him know you're here." "Of course." Valentina settled back in the chair, a pause. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to dismiss," Valentina said, and this time the smile reached something realer underneath it, something that might have been, in other circumstances, something close to respect. "That's not an insult." "I know," Sienna said. "It doesn't make me feel better about this conversation." She went back down to the hall and knocked on the door of Dominic's study and opened it without waiting. He was standing at his desk, the call apparently finished, his phone still in his hand, his expression doing the specific thing it did when he'd just received information he needed to assess. "Valentina's here," she said. He looked up. "I know. Marcus just told me." "She came up without asking." "She does that?" "She was asking me questions about the pregnancy." His expression changed. Something in it tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Personal ones, dressed up as professional concern." Sienna stopped in the doorway. "She said your protectiveness of me is creating exposure, that it's affecting your judgment." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "She said that to you directly?" "Yes." He set his phone down on the desk. He looked at the window and then back at her, and the stillness in him was back, but it was a different quality of stillness from the domestic version she'd gotten used to over 2 weeks. This was the occupational stillness, the one that preceded decisions. "I'll handle it," he said. "I don't need you to handle it. I need you to know it happened." "There's a difference?" "Yes," she said. "There's a large difference. Me telling you something and you going to fix it are 2 separate things, and I need you to know the difference because we have—" She stopped, pressed her hand to the doorframe. "We have a whole future of me needing to tell you things without you immediately turning them into something you go solve. Do you understand what I'm saying?" He looked at her for a long moment. I understand what you're saying. Good. I'm still going to talk to Valentina. That's your business with her. That's fine. She dropped her hand from the doorframe. Just know the difference. She went back to the living room. She sat down. She did not open her laptop because her hands were not quite steady, and she was not going to perform composure right now. She was just going to sit here and breathe and acknowledge to herself that Valentina Russo's precise, assessing eyes and her careful words about exposure and mistakes had gotten under her skin in a way she hadn't wanted them to. She heard Dominic's footsteps pass the living room, going toward the second sitting room. She heard the door close. She did not hear what was said in that room. She heard the register of voices through the wall, Dominic's flat and controlled, Valentina's low and even, and she did not try to make out the words. But they were in that room for 45 minutes, and when the door opened again, she heard Valentina's heels in the hallway, and then the front door, and then quiet. Dominic appeared in the living room doorway. He looked tired in a way that was different from his usual tiredness. Something had been worked at in there. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "It's handled," he said. "I told you I didn't need... I know what you told me." He crossed to the couch and sat down at the other end of it, and he leaned his elbows on his knees and looked at the coffee table. "She's not wrong," he said, after a moment. "About some of it." Sienna waited. "My judgment has changed," he said, "in how I'm thinking about certain things, certain risks, what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not." He looked up. "She's right that it's different. She's wrong about what it means." "What does it mean?" He looked at her directly. "It means I have something worth protecting now." A beat. Two things. The room was very quiet. Sienna thought about 12 weeks alone, about hospital fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and resignation letters and the particular quality of his face looking at an ultrasound screen. About Valentina Russo's careful eyes saying men who are protective make mistakes, and the cold intelligence in it, and the fact that the cold intelligence was not wrong, not technically, and that the terrifying thing was not that Sienna was a vulnerability. The terrifying thing was that she didn't want to stop being one. "She'll cause problems," Sienna said. "Probably. You knew that before I told you she was here." "Yes." She looked at him. "And you're not going to do the calculating thing, the thing where you weigh the assets and the liabilities and make the rational decision." Something in his face did something that was not quite painful, but was adjacent to it. "I've spent my whole life doing the calculating thing," he said. "I'm trying to learn a different way." He paused. "I'm not good at it yet." "No," she said. "But you're trying." She opened her laptop again. He stayed on the other end of the couch, and after a few minutes picked up one of the cracked spine books from the coffee table and opened it, and they sat there in the same room in the evening quiet of the penthouse. And it was not simple, and it was not resolved, and Valentina Russo was out there somewhere in the city with her careful eyes and her 9 years of history and her professional concern about exposure, and nothing about any of this was going to stay quiet. But right now, for this hour, it was still. 3 days later, Sienna's phone rang at 6 in the morning. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Hart." The voice was male, flat, professional. "My name is Ray Colton. I'm a journalist with the New York Standard. I'm reaching out for comment on a story we're running this week about Dominic Moretti's personal life, specifically regarding a pregnancy and reports that the child's mother is a former employee who..." Sienna hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed with the phone in her hand and her heart moving hard in her chest, and the city going pale and gray outside her window. And she understood with sudden, complete clarity that the still hour in the living room had been exactly that, 1 hour, and that whatever was coming next had already started before she was ready for it. She sat on the edge of the bed for 40 seconds, counted them. Then she got up, washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, the circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the face of a woman who had been bracing for impact long enough that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without bracing. And then she went down the hall and knocked on Dominic's bedroom door, hard enough that it wasn't really a knock. He opened it in 30 seconds. He was already dressed, which meant he'd been up for a while, which meant he had already heard. "You knew," she said. "Marcus flagged it 20 minutes ago. I was going to..." "How long has this been building?" He stepped back from the door. "Come inside." "How long, Dominic?" "A few days." He said it flat and direct, which she appreciated and resented simultaneously. We identified a leak 3 days ago. Someone inside the organization passed information to a journalist. We've been trying to locate the source before it ran. She stepped into the room. It was spare, like the rest of the penthouse. A large bed with dark covers, a desk in the corner with 2 monitors, the particular organized minimalism of a person who didn't spend enough time in the space to accumulate anything. She crossed to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment because she needed a second where he couldn't see her face. What's the story? It hasn't run yet. Colton is at the Standard. He's done pieces on organized crime adjacency before, nothing that's ever stuck. The angle is a pause. The kind of pause that meant he was selecting words. The angle is that you trapped me, that the pregnancy is calculated, that you were placed in my organization specifically to what? To leverage access. She turned around. To leverage access, she repeated. I know it's not true. Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it. I'm asking who is saying it. He looked at her steadily. We have a strong suspicion about the source. Tell me. Sienna. Don't manage this right now. Tell me who. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Valentina. The word landed in the room and sat there, and she looked at him and thought about the sitting room and the careful eyes and men who are protective make mistakes and the 45 minutes behind a closed door. And she thought about how she'd sat on the other end of the couch afterward and told him Valentina would cause problems. And he had said probably with the ease of a man who thought probably meant eventually and not 72 hours later at 6 in the morning. You talked to her 3 days ago, Sienna said. Yes. And you told me it was handled. The silence was answer enough. What did you say to her? Sienna said. In that room, what exactly did you say? He moved to the desk and leaned against it, arms crossed, and the posture was the professional one, the contained one. And she watched him and thought about 4 years of watching that posture and knowing that it meant he was marshaling something. I told her that my personal life was not her concern, he said, that the partnership structure between us was not changing because of my private circumstances, that she had no standing to question decisions I made about my household. And she took that as a demotion, he said. Yes, which it was, which she understood correctly. Sienna pressed her fingers against the window glass. Cold. The city was just starting to move below them, early light going gray-gold across the buildings. So she went to a journalist. She gave him a source, background, deniable, the kind of thing that looks like industry gossip until it's in print and then it's permanent. And once it's in print, every outlet picks it up. The framing sticks. It doesn't matter that it's not true. The story becomes the reference point. He paused. Your name becomes attached to a specific narrative. She understood what he wasn't saying. In his world, the visible part and the invisible part both. Narrative was leverage. A story about Sienna Hart as a calculating opportunist who'd gotten pregnant to secure access to one of New York's most powerful men wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a weapon. It would follow her daughter. Can you stop it from running? She said. We're working on it. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. He uncrossed his arms. I have people talking to the Standard's legal counsel. There are grounds for injunction. The piece contains information obtained through breach of confidentiality agreements with the organization. That buys time. It doesn't guarantee suppression. She turned from the window. And Valentina. His jaw tightened. Valentina is being dealt with. What does that mean? It means the alliance is over. He said it without hesitation, without the calculation she'd half expected. The partnership, the shared interests in the European operations, the standing access, all of it, done. She looked at him. That's worth a significant amount of money. Yes. You built that over 9 years. Yes. And you're cutting it because she went after me. He looked at her directly, without the careful professional distance, without the management. She went after you and our daughter, he said. There's no version of that I tolerate. Sienna breathed, looked at the desk and the monitors and the spare, functional room of a man who had organized his entire life around not needing anyone, and thought about what it cost him to say that sentence and what it cost her to receive it. I need to get dressed, she said. I need to think. Okay, don't make any moves on Valentina without telling me first. He paused. Why? Because I want to understand what you're doing and why. Not after, before. She picked up the water glass from his nightstand and drank from it because her mouth was dry and she didn't care whose glass it was. If this is going to be a partnership, it is. Then act like it. She went back to her room. She sat on the bed and she put her hand on her stomach and she stayed there for 10 minutes, just breathing, which was all she could do, which was sometimes all there was. The story ran anyway. Not the Standard. The Standard's legal team pulled the piece at 11 a.m. under the threat of litigation. By 2 in the afternoon, a version of it had appeared on 3 separate industry blogs, shorter, less detailed, sourced to people familiar with the matter. And by 4 o'clock, it had been picked up by 2 gossip outlets and 1 legitimate financial publication that ran a sidebar framing it as questions about leadership stability at Moretti Enterprises. Sienna read all of it. She shouldn't have, but she did. She sat in the living room with her laptop and she read every version of herself that Valentina Russo had handed to strangers to construct. And she was careful to keep her face still because Marcus was at the kitchen counter and she was not going to let anyone in this building see her break down over someone else's story about who she was. The words were specific and surgical. Former executive assistant. Pregnancy revealed under dramatic circumstances. Sources close to the organization question whether Ms. Hart's position in Mr. Moretti's personal life reflects a professional relationship that became inappropriately entangled. One of the blogs used the word calculated twice. One used the phrase long game. She closed the laptop. She went to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists, which was something she did when she needed to slow her pulse. And she looked at herself in the mirror again and she said out loud quietly to no one, "This is not who you are," which was the kind of thing that sounded hollow and was nevertheless necessary to say. When she came back out, Dominic was in the living room. He had his phone in one hand and the expression that meant he had been reading the same things and was containing the response to it through the same exhausting machinery he contained everything through. "I've seen it," she said, before he could speak. "Sienna, I don't want to talk about what it says." She sat down on the couch. "I want to talk about what happens next." He sat in the chair across from her, set his phone face down on the coffee table, which she had learned was his version of putting everything else aside. "I'm issuing a statement through the organization's communications office. Straightforward, no details, no engagement with the narrative, just a clear declaration of the facts. That I'm going to have your child, and I live here. That you are my partner, and that we are expecting a daughter. And that any characterization to the contrary is false and will be challenged legally." She absorbed that. Partner. Is that the wrong word? She thought about it. About the word, and what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and the conversation they had never technically had about what this was, what the arrangement was, beyond the practical logistics of a pregnant woman, and a penthouse, and a man trying to learn a different way of operating. "It's not wrong," she said carefully. "It's just bigger than we've said out loud." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying it anyway." She looked at the coffee table, at the cracked spine books, and the glass of water she'd apparently carried in from the kitchen at some point without noticing. "There's something I need to ask you," she said. "Ask." "Did you know Valentina would react this way when you ended the alliance?" He was quiet. "Dominic." "I knew she would react," he said. "I underestimated the speed and the directness. But you knew there would be consequences for me." He didn't look away. "Yes. And you made the decision anyway." "Yes." "Without telling me that was a risk." The pause this time was longer. He picked up his phone from the coffee table and set it down again without looking at it, the gesture of a man managing an impulse. "I thought I could contain it before it reached you. I was wrong." "You thought you could protect me from the consequences of your own decision," she said, without letting me weigh in on whether I wanted that protection. "Yes," he said, flat, direct, no softening. She stood up, not from anger, or not only from anger, but because she needed to move, needed to be vertical and in motion rather than sitting still absorbing this. She walked to the window and stood there the way she'd stood in his bedroom that morning, and looked at the city and tried to locate something solid inside herself to stand on. "I'm not a civilian," she said. "I'm not someone you protect by keeping things from. I have been in your world for 4 years. I know what I'm standing in. I need you to stop making choices about my life based on what you think I can handle." "That's fair," he said from behind her. "I know it's fair. I'm not asking for acknowledgement. I'm asking you to actually do it differently." "I know." She turned around. "Do you? Because you said you were trying to learn a different way, and I believe you mean it, but meaning it and doing it are not the same thing. And right now there are 3 stories online calling me a calculated opportunist, and I found out about the risk from a journalist at 6 in the morning, not from you." He stood. He moved to the window and stopped a foot away from her, and she held her ground because she was not going to step back from him anymore. Not in this penthouse. Not in this life they were building, whether they decided to build it or not. "You're right," he said. "All of it. You're right." She looked at him. At the controlled face and the exhausted eyes, and the jaw that was always tighter than it needed to be, and the hands at his sides that were not entirely still. "I need you to propose something to me," she said. It came out of her unexpectedly, and she didn't pull it back. He looked at her. "Not now," she said. "Not today, not as damage control, not as a statement for the communications office. But I need to know that at some point you're going to say it like you mean it. Because the word partner doesn't cover what this is, and it doesn't cover what our daughter is going to need, and I don't want to still be figuring out what we are to each other when she arrives." He was very still. "I'm not saying yes," she said. "I'm not even saying I'll say yes. I'm saying I need to know that it's coming, that you're—" She stopped, pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "That you're in this." "I'm in this," he said, and then quietly, "I've been in this for longer than you know." She looked at him. "The gala wasn't an accident for me," he said. The words were coming out careful and slow, the way he said things that were being said for the first time outside his own head. "I didn't know what to do with it. I handled it badly. I've handled most of this badly." He paused. "But I have never, not once in 4 years, looked at you the way you think I looked at you after. Like a mistake. I looked at you like a man who had gotten close to something that was going to change everything and didn't know how to survive it." Sienna breathed. "I'm still not entirely sure how to survive it," he said, "but I'm not trying to find my way out anymore." The city moved below them, indifferent and enormous. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was not going to stand here and cry. She was absolutely not going to do that, and she mostly succeeded. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I'm going to go lie down. The nausea is coming back." "Okay." She moved past him toward the hallway, and she stopped when she was level with him, and she did something she hadn't planned, something that came from the same unplanned place as the question she'd just asked. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just the side of her hand against his forearm, there and then gone, barely a touch. He didn't move, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. She went down the hall. She lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling, and she thought about what he'd said and what it meant and what was coming, because something was still coming. She could feel it, the particular atmospheric pressure of a situation that had not yet reached its worst point. And she was right, because 2 hours later, Marcus came to her door with an expression she had never seen on him before and said quietly, "There's been a development. Mr. Moretti needs you in the study." She got up. In the study, Dominic was standing at his desk with his phone in his hand, and every trace of the man who had been talking to her at the window, the unguarded one, the one practicing a different way, was gone. What was in the room was the other version, the version that ran the things no one talked about, the version that made men go pale. "What happened?" she said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. A photograph. Grainy, taken from a distance through a window. Her, in the kitchen of the penthouse, recognizable, and next to her the unmistakable outline of a man leaning across the counter toward her in a posture that, taken out of context, looked like nothing that it was and everything that it wasn't. The man in the photo was Marcus. The caption beneath it on the blog post read, "Who is really the father?" She looked at the photograph. She looked at Dominic. His face was absolute, the stillness of something pushed past the point where compression still worked, and she understood in that instant that this was not about the photograph. This was about what he had felt in the 2 seconds before he understood what he was looking at. The 2 seconds of something dark and violent moving through him before his intelligence caught up with his reaction. He had believed it. For 2 seconds, he had believed it. And she could see that he had believed it. And he could see that she could see it. And there was nothing either of them could do about that. Window. She had planted a device in the room before she left it and walked down the hallway and out the front door with her careful smile and her tailored coat and her 9 years of history that Dominic had just cut in half with one conversation. Sienna looked at the device on the counter for a long time without touching it. "Where's Dominic?" she said. "His study," Dyson said. "He's been informed." She went to the study. She didn't knock. Dominic was standing at his desk with both hands flat on the surface, not sitting, just standing, looking at a point on the desk that was not a document or a phone, but just a point. The expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he didn't like and was making himself look at it directly. "She heard everything," Sienna said. "Yes." "The conversation in the sitting room, what you said to her, what she said to me?" "Yes." "And before that? Whatever was said in that room in the weeks before I moved in?" "Yes." He straightened, looked at her. "The device was active before your arrival, which means she was planning this before I ended the alliance. The ending wasn't the trigger, it was the acceleration." Sienna stood in the doorway. She came here to plant it herself, the day she came up without asking. His jaw was tight enough to be visible. "Marcus gave her access because she had standing clearance. I hadn't revoked it yet. She knew the window." He paused. She knew exactly how long she had. 9 years, Sienna said. Not accusatory. Just the fact of it. The cold arithmetic of a woman who had spent 9 years learning the architecture of Dominic Moretti's world in enough detail to place a device in a room she could access on a Thursday morning and walk out of without anyone looking twice. "I underestimated her," he said. It came out flat and precise, the way he said things he found unacceptable about himself. "You trusted her. I trusted her professionally, which is different. I didn't account for—" He stopped. "For the fact that it was personal for her," Sienna said. He was quiet. She crossed the room and stood at the side of the desk. Not behind it, not across from it, beside it, next to him. "Was it?" she said. "Personal for her." He looked at the window. "Valentina and I have a specific history," he said. "It was never—" He stopped, tried again. "Years ago, before the professional relationship solidified, there was a period where it could have gone differently. I made a decision that it wouldn't. She accepted that. Or I believed she had." Sienna processed this quietly. "And then I arrived. And then you arrived." He turned to look at her. And something that had been decided apparently became undecided in her assessment. She thought about the sitting room, about the careful eyes and the word exposure, and the way Valentina had said, "You're not what I expected," with something underneath it that Sienna had read as close to respect, but might have been something else entirely. Might have been the particular look of a woman who understood, in that room, exactly what she was dealing with, and had already decided what to do about it. "She's not finished," Sienna said. "No. The photograph, the stories, the device, that's not the end of it. That's the setup." "I know." He picked up his phone. "I have a meeting tonight. The families, there's a quarterly review. It's been scheduled for 6 weeks. I can't move it. The timing is terrible." "Yes." He looked at her. "I need Marcus here with you." "Then take someone else to the meeting." "The meeting requires Marcus. He's the one who—" He stopped, looked at the phone. The internal calculation she could see running behind his eyes was visible and fast and not entirely comfortable to watch. "I'll send 2 additional people, Dyson and Chen. They stay on this floor." "Dominic." She waited until he looked at her. "Go to the meeting. I'm fine." "You're 20 weeks pregnant and someone has been watching this apartment, and you have obligations that exist independently of me," she said. "Go. Deal with your business. I'll be here." He looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression that had no name in her catalog for him yet. Something between trust and resistance. The look of a man learning to let someone stand on their own, while every instinct he had was telling him to stand in front of them instead. "Call me if anything—" "I'll call you," she said. He left at 7. The penthouse was quiet. Dyson was in the hallway. Chen was at the building entrance. Sienna ate dinner alone at the kitchen counter, standing up because sitting felt too still. And she thought about Valentina Russo and 9 years and devices and vents, and the particular patience of someone who had been building toward something for a long time and was not close to done. She was right. At 9:47, her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she had stopped not answering unknown numbers the day Colton had called. The voice was not Valentina's. It was male. Calm. Professional, the same flat professional as Colton, but different. This was not a journalist's neutral. This was the neutral of someone who delivered messages for a living and had no personal investment in the content. Ms. Hart, there's something you should see before tomorrow morning. Something that will be public at 6 a.m. unless certain decisions are made tonight. A pause. Ms. Russo would like to meet. Sienna's hand was steady on the phone. She was proud of that. Her heart was doing something loud and unpleasant against her ribs, but her hand was steady. Where? She said. She called Dominic immediately. Straight to voicemail. The meeting, no phones, she knew this. She'd managed the calendar for it for 3 years running. She texted Marcus, waited 90 seconds for a response that didn't come, which meant Marcus's phone was also off the table. She sat on the couch with the address the man had texted her, and she thought about it. A hotel bar in Midtown, public, populated. Not the kind of location you chose if the goal was physical. Too many witnesses, too much exposure for someone already trying to manage the narrative. Valentina Russo was not crude. She had established that. This was a conversation, not a threat. Except that everything Valentina did was a threat wearing a conversation's clothing. Sienna told Dyson she was going out. Dyson said he'd come with her. She said fine and meant it. She wasn't reckless, just decided. And they took the car from the building garage with Dyson driving and Sienna in the back, watching the city move past the window and thinking about what Valentina had that she wanted to show, what she had that hadn't already been deployed, what escalation looked like when the first 3 moves had already been played. The bar was on the 22nd floor of a glass hotel she'd attended 3 Moretti organization events at, which felt deliberate, which was probably deliberate, which was the point about Valentina. Everything was deliberate. The room, the timing, the choice to go through Sienna instead of waiting for Dominic, all of it constructed. Sienna understood constructed. She had spent 4 years inside a world built entirely of it. Valentina was at a corner table. The tailored coat had been replaced by a dark dress, the short hair immaculate, a glass of wine on the table in front of her that she hadn't touched. She looked like a woman who had been sitting with absolute stillness for a while and could continue doing so indefinitely. Sienna sat across from her. She didn't order anything. Dyson took a position at the bar 20 feet away, visible to both of them, which Valentina registered with a glance and no comment. "You came," Valentina said. "You said there was something I needed to see." "I said before 6 a.m. Valentina tilted her head. "I expected Dominic." "Dominic's in a meeting." "I know." A pause. "I know what meeting. I know who's in the room and what's on the table and what they're deciding." She reached into the bag beside her chair and set a tablet on the table between them. "Look at this." Sienna looked. It was a document. Long, detailed, formatted with the specificity of something produced by a legal team rather than assembled informally. She read the header, read the first 2 paragraphs. Then she stopped and looked at Valentina. "Where did you get this?" she said. "It was sent to me," Valentina said, "by someone at the table tonight who is aware of my current disagreement with Dominic and believes I might find the contents relevant." Sienna looked back at the document. Read further this time, past the header and the formal language, into the substance of it, and the further she read, the colder the room seemed to get. Or not the room. The thing inside her chest, the thing that had been slowly, painfully learning to trust the architecture of what she and Dominic were building. The document was a proposal from one of the families at tonight's meeting. It outlined a consolidation of interests, a restructuring of the New York operational territory, and attached to the restructuring was a condition, a specific, clearly stated condition. Dominic Moretti would be required to sever all personal associations that created potential legal or public exposure for the organization. The language was formal and indirect. The meaning was not. She was the exposure. Their daughter was the exposure. The proposal required Dominic to end it, publicly, cleanly, in a way that demonstrated the organization's interest took precedence over his personal situation. And the proposal was dated 3 weeks ago, which meant it had been on the table since before the stories ran, since before the photograph, since before the device in the vent, all of which meant that the pressure campaign had not been Valentina acting alone out of personal grievance. It had been coordinated. Valentina was one piece of a structure that had been built specifically to force Dominic's hand at this table tonight. Sienna set the tablet down. Her breathing was even. She was making it even through sheer mechanics, through the deliberate control of the inhale and exhale, because the alternative was something she could not afford in this room with this woman watching her. He doesn't know about this proposal, Sienna said. He knows about it tonight, Valentina said. It was presented at the start of the meeting. She paused. 3 hours ago. 3 hours. He'd been in that room for 3 hours with this on the table, and he had not called, which meant his phone was off, which meant he had not yet. He hasn't answered because the meeting protocol requires phones off, Sienna said. Steady. Not because he's already agreed. Of course not. Valentina's voice was careful and even. But the families holding this proposal represent combined interests that are significant. Refusing has consequences. In his world, refusing that kind of unanimous pressure is not a small thing. I know what it is. Do you? Valentina reached out and turned the tablet slightly, not toward herself, but angled between them, the gesture of someone making a point about ownership. Because there's a version of this that ends well for you. The proposal includes provisions for settlement, financial, for the child. You would not be left without resources. Sienna looked at her. He's being asked to choose, Valentina said simply, between the organization and you, and I want you to understand what that choice costs him before you decide whether you're willing to let him make it. You want me to leave, Sienna said. I want you to understand the stakes. No. Sienna leaned forward slightly, just enough. You want me scared. You want me to look at that document and think about what it means for him to refuse it and decide that the right thing, the kind thing, is to take the settlement and go. You want me to do the work for you. She paused. Because if I leave on my own, you don't have to be the one who broke it. Valentina's expression did not change, but something behind it moved. Something she controlled quickly and completely, but not quickly enough. You're protecting him, Sienna said. That's what this is, underneath all of it. You're not trying to destroy him. You're trying to save him from a decision you think he's not capable of making clearly. She kept her voice even. You're in love with him. The bar noise continued around them. Glasses and low conversation and the particular ambient sound of a city that never paused for anyone's revelation. Valentina picked up her wine glass, took a single measured sip, set it down. Be careful, she said quietly. I'm not being cruel, Sienna said. I'm saying it because it matters. Because if that's true, if this whole thing is constructed on that foundation, then you know, somewhere, that it doesn't work. You can't build something real on someone else's fear. You're 20 weeks pregnant and sitting in a hotel bar at 10 at night because you couldn't reach him, Valentina said. Tell me about real. That landed. Sienna felt it land. She didn't show it. He'll refuse the proposal, she said. You know he will. Yes, Valentina said, and for the first time her voice had something in it that was not constructed, not careful, not the precise instrument she'd been using all evening. Something tired and old and losing. I know he will. That's the problem. Sienna stood. Her legs were steady. She was grateful for that, distantly, in the part of her mind that was still cataloging things. Don't contact me again, she said. If you have something to say to Dominic, say it to Dominic. She walked to Dyson at the bar. Didn't look back. Through the glass elevator down to the lobby, and out to the car, and into the back seat, and the door closed, and the city outside the window, and Dyson at the wheel, and she pressed both hands flat on her thighs and breathed through the shaking that started the moment she was out of Valentina's sightline. The kind of shaking that isn't fear. The kind that's the body processing something the mind held together through force of will and is only now being allowed to feel. Her phone buzzed. Dominic. She answered before the second buzz. Where are you? He said, and his voice was tight and immediate and not the operational register, not the managed one. I'm in the car. I'm fine. I went to meet Valentina. A beat of silence that was not empty. You what? She had someone call me. She said there was something I needed to see before 6 a.m. Sienna kept her voice level. I saw it. I know about the proposal. Another silence. Longer. Dominic, she said, what did you say? I refused it, he said, 40 minutes ago. The meeting ended with... He stopped. She could hear him moving somewhere, footsteps, a door. It ended badly. There are going to be consequences I need to manage. I need to know you're... I'm fine. You went to meet her alone. Dyson was with me. I'm fine. She pressed her hand against her stomach. The baby had been still all evening and was still now, and she was monitoring that awareness underneath everything else. I need you to come home. I'm already moving. I know you refused it, she said, and her voice did something she hadn't planned, something that cracked slightly at the edge of the word. I need you to know that I didn't ask you to, that I wouldn't have asked you to. I know you wouldn't have, he said. That's not why I did it. Then why? The car moved through the midtown streets, red and white lights streaking past the window, the city enormous and relentless and entirely indifferent to two people on a phone in the middle of a night that had changed the shape of everything. Because there is no version of my life that I want that doesn't have you in it, he said. Simply. Without the compression, without the management, without the machinery, just the plain fact of it, said out loud for the first time. There hasn't been for a long time, and I am done pretending I don't know that. Sienna pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling of the car. The consequences, she said, when she could trust her voice. How bad? Significant, he said. We'll talk about it when I get there. It's manageable. It's going to require... He paused. It's going to require us to be completely solid. Whatever they try next, and they will try next, I need us to be something they can't move. She thought about Valentina's face when she'd said, I know he will. That's the problem. About the tired, losing thing underneath the careful construction of a woman who had spent years building something she never named and was watching it choose someone else. I have a condition, Sienna said. Name it. When you get here and we've talked about the consequences and what comes next, she paused. I want you to ask me properly. Not for the organization, not as strategy. I want it to be real. The pause on his end was short. It will be, he said. The car turned onto their block. The building came into view, lit and solid against the night sky. Dyson pulling smoothly to the entrance. And somewhere in the city behind her, the families who'd brought that proposal to a table were regrouping, recalculating, looking for the next angle in the way that people who had never been refused always did. And somewhere Valentina Russo was sitting at a corner table with an untouched glass of wine and the particular exhaustion of a long game that had finally, irrevocably, lost the only thing it had ever actually been about. He was home in 22 minutes. Sienna heard the elevator before she heard the door, the particular mechanical sound of it stopping at their floor, the one she'd learned to distinguish from the building's other movements in the weeks she'd lived here. She was sitting on the couch with her shoes off and her hands in her lap, and the city doing its indifferent nighttime thing beyond the windows, and she heard the door and then his footsteps, and then he was in the living room doorway, and they looked at each other across the room with the particular quality of attention two people give each other when they have both just come through something and are still taking inventory of the damage. He looked worn, not broken. Dominic Moretti did not break. She understood that about him now, in a way she hadn't at the start of all this. But worn down to something underneath the usual layers. Jacket gone, tie loosened, the careful architecture of his public presentation stripped back to the man underneath it. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't released and probably wouldn't until he'd processed whatever had happened in that room tonight. And his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was running assessments, cataloging, checking. He crossed the room and sat on the coffee table directly in front of her, which was not where people sat, which meant he needed to be close and didn't want the length of the couch between them. His elbows went to his knees. He looked at her face. "You're all right," he said. Not a question, confirming. "I'm all right," she said. He reached out and put one hand over both of hers in her lap. Just that. He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there with his hand over hers, and she felt the warmth of it and the slight unsteadiness in it that he was controlling and not entirely succeeding at, and she turned her hands over so her fingers wrapped around his. "Tell me what happened in the meeting," she said. He told her. All of it, which she understood was not how he usually operated. Usually there were categories of information, things that were hers to know, and things that were managed away from her for reasons that were partly protection and partly the ingrained habit of a man who had kept his own counsel for so long that sharing felt like structural damage. Tonight he told her everything. The proposal and who had brought it, the three families involved and their specific interests, the way it had been positioned as unanimous when it wasn't, the two people in the room who had not signed on to it and had said so quietly and at some personal cost to themselves. He told her about refusing it and what had been said in the room after, the particular quality of silence that follows a decision that can't be undone, and the exit from the meeting that had been functional and civil on the surface and was going to have consequences beneath the surface for a long time. She listened without interrupting. She asked two questions, both practical, about the timeline of likely consequences, about the two families who hadn't signed the proposal. He answered both directly. When he was done, she said, "The two who didn't sign, do you trust them?" "As much as I trust anyone in those rooms." "Are they going to hold?" "For now." He paused. "Long term depends on what happens next and how I manage the fallout." "What does the fallout look like?" He was quiet for a moment. "Lost revenue on 3 joint operations. A restructuring that's going to cost time and capital. Some movement in the legal business that I'll need to contain." He looked at their hands. "Nothing that takes the organization down. Nothing that can't be navigated. But it's not small." "It's not small," she agreed. "No." He looked up. "I need you to know that I know what I traded. I'm not going to pretend it was costless." "I know you're not. And I need you to know that I would do it again." He said it without drama, without the weight of a declaration, just the plain factual delivery of a thing he knew to be true. "Not because I'm being reckless with what I built, because there's a version of everything I've built that means nothing if I use it as the reason to walk away from you. I watched my father make that calculation. I know what it produces." She looked at him, at the tired, honest face of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing an identity out of control and distance and calculated self-sufficiency, sitting on a coffee table at 11 at night holding her hands. "I know," she said. And then, because it needed to be said out loud, "I love you. I have loved you for a long time, and I spent 12 weeks trying to run from it, and I'm done running." He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I know." And then, "I love you. I should have said it before tonight. I should have said it a long time before tonight." "Yes," she said, "you should have." Something in his face moved, something between the pain of the acknowledgement and the relief of the plain fact of it finally living outside his chest. "I'm going to be better at saying it," he said. "I'm not going to be perfect at it." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm not asking for perfect." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which he had apparently kept with him through the entire meeting and the drive home, and he set a small box on the coffee table between them. Dark blue. Simple. The kind of box that didn't perform anything. She looked at it, then at him. "This is not damage control," he said. "I had this 3 weeks ago. I didn't know how to find the right moment, which is its own kind of failure, but I want you to know it existed before tonight, before the proposal, before any of it." She picked up the box, opened it. The ring inside was not enormous or theatrical, a single stone, clean setting, the kind of thing chosen by someone who had thought about the person rather than the gesture. She looked at it for a long moment. "Ask me," she said. "Marry me," he said, simply. No preamble, no speech, just the 2 words said the way he said things that mattered, like a fact he was making rather than a question he was asking. She looked at the ring, at the city behind him through the window, at the hands that had been steady through an entire evening that had required steadiness and were not entirely steady now. "Yes," she said. The weeks after were not easy. She wanted to be honest about that, in the way she'd made herself be honest about everything since the hospital floor, since the decision to stop running. They were not a montage of resolved conflict and warm domestic peace. They were work. Constant, unglamorous, occasionally grinding work. The consequences Dominic had described came in the shape he'd predicted, and she was part of navigating them. Not from the outside, not protected away from the details, but actually present and informed, because they had agreed on that, and he kept the agreement even when it was uncomfortable for him, which it sometimes was. She sat in on 2 meetings she would previously have been excluded from, not as a participant, but as someone who was informed and present, and she watched him operate in the world he'd built and understood it more completely than 4 years as his assistant had given her. And it was not simple or clean or easy to love, but it was real in a way that nothing performed or managed could have been. The stories about her didn't disappear immediately. The internet does not retract with the same energy it deploys. And there were weeks when she could still find variations of the calculated opportunist narrative living in corners of the web she was trying not to look at. She looked at them anyway, twice, and then she made a decision to stop. Not because they didn't hurt, but because they were not the story she was living, and she was not going to let someone else's construction of her become the thing she organized her days around. Dominic issued the statement, partner, daughter. False characterizations would be challenged legally. It ran 2 paragraphs, and it was picked up, and it did the work it was supposed to do. Not eliminate, but reframe. Give people a different fact to attach to the name. It was enough. Valentina Russo left New York in the 3rd week. Sienna didn't know where she went and didn't ask. There was a final communication between Valentina and Dominic. He told her about it, brief and factual, a written message that had ended the professional relationship with the particular finality of things that are put on paper. He didn't tell her everything in the message, and she didn't ask for everything. Some things were his to carry. She was learning the difference between being informed and being owed every interior room of another person's history. Marcus, to his credit, came to Sienna directly 2 days after the device was found and said, "I gave Ms. Russo information I shouldn't have about your appointment timeline. I thought it was routine. I understand now that it wasn't, and I'm telling you directly because you deserve to hear it from me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Did Dominic know you were coming to tell me?" "No." "Okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded and left. And she thought about what it meant that he had come to her rather than managing it internally, and she decided it meant something, and she filed it accordingly. She went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the due date, which the doctor had said was possible, and which Sienna had prepared for logistically and had not entirely prepared for emotionally, because nothing about the speed of it, the way it moved from early discomfort to something urgent and real in the space of 2 hours, was what she'd mapped out in her careful, controlled way. Dominic was across the city. An emergency meeting she knew about, one of the ongoing consequence management sessions from the fallout of his refusal, the kind that couldn't be rescheduled because the people in the room had flown in from 3 different cities. She called him, and he picked up on the second ring, and she said, "It's happening." And he said, "I'm leaving now." And she heard him moving before the call ended. Marcus drove her to the hospital. She sat in the back seat and breathed through contractions that were already closer together than the apps said they should be at this stage. And she gripped the door handle and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the particular clarity that pain sometimes produces, about a positive test in a hospital bathroom, about a resignation letter that never got read, about the floor of a hallway and a plastic chair and an ultrasound screen and a ring box from an inside jacket pocket. She thought about how many times she had tried to control the shape of this story and how completely and comprehensively the story had refused to be controlled. She was still thinking about it when they arrived and stopped thinking about everything except the immediate physical reality of what her body was doing, which was considerable. Dominic arrived 47 minutes after her call. She knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock between contractions with the focused attention of someone who needs a specific number to hold on to. She heard him before she saw him. His voice in the hallway, low and fast and not performing calm, actually trying to locate it rather than performing it, asking questions, getting information, the sound of someone moving with absolute directness toward a single point. He came through the door and crossed to her bed and took her hand, and his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not fractured the way it had been in the hallway months ago, not the controlled fracturing of a man suppressing his reaction, just open, fully, uncomplicatedly open. The face of a person who has arrived somewhere that matters completely and is not trying to manage how much it shows. "I'm here," he said. "I can see that," she said, and her voice came out tight from the contraction that was starting, and she gripped his hand harder than she intended, and he didn't move, didn't flinch, just held on. What followed was not cinematic. It was long and exhausting, and there were hours that felt like they had been stretched to twice their natural length. And Sienna said things that were not composed or graceful, and Dominic sat in the chair beside her bed through all of it, not saying much because there was not much to say, just present, just there, just his hand when she needed it, and his voice when she asked for something, and his complete undivided attention on her in a way she had not understood until now was one of the most sustaining things a person could offer another. At 4:17 in the morning, their daughter was born. She was small and red-faced and furious about the transition from one world to the next, which Sienna thought, in the particular post-labor clarity that is like no other mental state she had ever experienced, was exactly right. The appropriate response to arrival. The appropriate response to being thrust without consent into something enormous and unknown. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, and she felt the weight of her, the specific, particular, irreducible weight of this new person. And she stopped thinking in words for a moment. Just stopped. Just held her. She looked at Dominic. He was standing at the side of the bed, and his face was doing something she had no catalog entry for and would never be able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't been in that room. His eyes were wet. She had never seen that before, and understood she was not likely to see it many times again, and she understood it for exactly what it was. A man who had spent his entire life building walls against the specific vulnerability of loving something that could be lost, encountering something that had walked straight through every wall he'd ever built, and set up residence in the middle of him without asking permission. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she shifted carefully, and he looked at his daughter for the first time, at the small, furious face and the tiny hands already balled into fists like she was prepared for a fight. And he reached out one careful finger, and she grabbed it with a grip that was absurdly strong for someone who had existed outside a body for approximately 4 minutes, and something in him, the last thing, the deepest held thing, the thing he'd been protecting for so long he'd stopped knowing it was there, let go. "Hi," he said, very quietly, to the baby. That was all. Just that. Sienna watched his face. She watched the man who had run a criminal empire with cold precision and never once let anyone see the cost of it, holding a 7-pound person with enormous gentleness and saying hi in a voice she had never heard come out of him before. And she thought about her mother's phrase, "finding your floor," and thought that this was it. This was where she stopped falling. This strange, difficult, hard-won, imperfect, real thing. This was the floor. They named her Elena, not after anyone. Just a name they had discussed in the kitchen at 11 at night 3 weeks before she arrived, both of them at the counter with tea that had gone cold, running through names the way you do when you are trying to find something that fits a person you haven't met yet but can feel coming toward you. Sienna had said it, and Dominic had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Yes," in the tone he used for things that were settled. The hospital ceremony was small. A judge who owed Dominic a favor of the professional rather than the criminal variety. 4 people on her side, 3 on his. The loyal kind, the ones who had been present through the worst of it and had not recalculated their position when the organization took its losses. She wore a dress she'd bought in the maternity section of a store on Madison Avenue because nothing else fit, and she had refused to be stressed about it, which was one of about 15 ways she had changed in the months since the penthouse and the couch, and the careful learning of a different way. The ceremony was 11 minutes, short because neither of them had ever been people who required ceremony to make things real. What made things real was the accumulation of decisions, the resignation letter she'd brought and he'd never read, the hospital floor, the plastic chair, the soup that had appeared without fanfare, the ring from an inside pocket, the 47 minutes between a phone call and a door opening. Dominic said, "I do," in the same tone he said everything that was settled. She said it and meant it in the marrow of her bones. The months after, she would later think, were the ones she hadn't known to want. Not the dramatic months. Not the months of crisis and consequence management and navigating the fallout of a man who had chosen love over leverage. Those had their own exhausting texture, real and important, and they were not finished. They would probably never be entirely finished, because the world Dominic operated in did not resolve cleanly, and she had accepted that as the cost of this particular life. But the other months, the ones where Elena slept in the room that had been Dominic's home office and was now filled with the particular soft light of a baby monitor and the quiet sounds of a person who was learning the world one small sensation at a time. The ones where Sienna worked from the kitchen counter on the freelance projects that had grown into something more substantial, something that was hers, built by her hands and her mind with no penthouse and no organization attached to it. The ones where Dominic came home before 8 more often than not. Not every night, not always. The world he ran did not accommodate always, but more often, and she had learned to distinguish between the version of him that walked in still carrying the day and the version that walked in and set it down at the door. And she had learned that the second version was the one she'd spent 4 years glimpsing in the spaces between his walls and had never believed was consistent enough to be the truth of him. It was. It just required something to make it worth the effort of coming home to. One morning, Elena was 4 months old, pulling herself toward upright with an intensity that Sienna recognized as genetic. Dominic came into the kitchen at 7 a.m. and picked the baby up from the floor mat where she'd been conducting her project, and Elena grabbed his nose, which she had discovered was hilarious and repeatable. And he made the face he made when she did this, pained and helpless and trying not to smile and failing, and carried her to the window to show her the city going gold in the early light, narrating it in a low voice, the bridge and the water and the buildings, like she could understand, like it mattered that she know the shape of the world she'd arrived in. Sienna stood at the counter with her coffee and watched them. She thought about the woman who had stood outside a door with a resignation letter, telling herself that disappearing was the rational choice, that love was something to be managed and controlled and, if necessary, evacuated from. She thought about 12 weeks of carrying something alone because she had been so certain of how it would go, so certain that the worst version of the story was the only honest one. She thought about how wrong she had been. Not wrong to be afraid. The fear had been real and legitimate and earned. Not wrong to protect herself. A woman who doesn't protect herself in a world like this one doesn't last. But wrong about what was on the other side of the fear. Wrong about what she would find if she stopped running. Dominic turned from the window and caught her looking at him, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the kitchen, with the baby in his arms reaching for the light and the city going about its enormous indifferent business behind the glass. And his face was the open one, the real one. And she thought about a plastic chair and a document in an inside pocket and a man learning to say things out loud for the first time. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her in the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. "You're thinking something." "I'm thinking a lot of things." "Name one." She set her coffee down, crossed the kitchen to where he was standing and put her hand on Elena's back, the warm, solid weight of her, and looked at Dominic and thought about what was true and said it. "I'm thinking that the thing I was most afraid of turned out to be the thing I needed most." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I think it's worth knowing." He looked at her. Something in his face settled. Not the stillness of suppression, but the stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere and recognized it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Elena grabbed Sienna's finger with her other hand, the same iron grip she'd been born with, holding both of them simultaneously with the absolute confidence of someone who doesn't yet know the world could be otherwise. And Sienna felt the pull of it, the specific gravity of this moment, this kitchen, these two people who had taken the long and difficult and costly route to standing here. She had thought, once, that the positive test was the end of the life she'd planned. She understood now that it had never been an ending. It had been the first honest thing in a long line of managed half-truths she'd been telling herself about what she wanted and what she was worth, and what was possible for a woman who had spent 4 years loving someone from 3 steps behind and believing that was all she was ever going to get. She had been wrong about that too. The city moved below them. Elena squinted at the light. Dominic stood at the window of the penthouse that had stopped being a showpiece the moment it became a place people actually lived in. And he held their daughter and kept his eyes on Sienna's face, and outside the glass the world went on being large and complicated and not particularly interested in any individual's happiness. But in this kitchen, at this hour, with the coffee going cold on the counter and the baby trying to eat the morning light, and the man beside her who had learned, imperfectly and at great cost, that strength was not the same thing as invulnerability. In here, it was enough, more than enough. It was finally and completely everything.